For my comparative study, I decided to focus on the genre of horror. To carry out my analysis, I'll be tackling two movies belonging to the genre. Suspiria, released in Italy during 1977 and directed by Dario Argento, belonging to the subgenre of giallo. The term emerged in Italy during 1970s and is characterized for its use of stylized violence, psychological thriller, and surreal visuals. The movie is considered a trademark for the subgenre, focusing on the arrival of Susie to a ballet school located in Germany and how they starts having encounters with mysterious deaths and paranormal activity. As my second movie, The Conjuring, belonging to the American horror genre, released in 2013 and directed by James Wan. Almost 40 years later, the movie depicts the most key trademarks of the American horror genre, which are characterized by following a certain typical structure and include classical horror elements such as the haunted house, supernatural creatures, and exorcisms. I'll be exploring how both movies work similarly or differently to achieve the visual and emotional representation of haunted spaces, which is used as a force of control and manipulation on the characters. I'll be analyzing film elements such as symbols, motifs, filmmakers' intentions towards cinematography, and mise-en-scene in relation to the institutional and sociocultural context of both films. The movie Suspiria takes place in a dance academy, specifically located in Freiburg, Germany, during the 1970s. The academy is used as a symbol of oppressive systems and places where the characters, in this case the students, are probably forced to be under the control of a major force, as is the case of the witches. The intention behind the setting of the story is to convey the feelings of isolation from the characters' points of view. The relation between the isolation of the characters by means of the setting, in combination with the context of an institution, works to evoke the feelings of oppressed innocence and the huge development of the protagonist's character, in terms of confronting the issues that she is presented to. The institutional context in the movie Suspiria can also relate to the element of narrative structure. Along the story, the character will have to witness or go through difficulties, such as in this case, paranormal experiences. The way in which the character of Susie arrives on its own to a closed environment portrays her helplessness and independence, given that she'll later have to witness and experience paranormal situations, to which she is completely helpless, and seems no way out of them. In the scene shown here, through both actions, we are able to appreciate the way in which the protagonist feels submerged in a complete oppression from the headmasters. From this initial vision, we later are presented with a different one, given that somehow she'll have to overcome those difficulties. As we see in the final scene here, where she eventually pushes her character into the limit of the dangerous and the supernatural, such as the dead alive corpse of the major witch of the academy. On the other hand, in the movie The Conjuring, the film takes place in a farmhouse located in Rhode Island. The context of institution comes into play when the movie deals with religious and orthodox practices. The Conjuring stars the real-life paranormal investigators Lorraine and Ed Warren, who are in charge of helping the parent family to escape the curse that possessed them. Although the exorcism takes place at the end of the movie, we've been introduced to different representations of religious motifs, such as artifacts, religious spaces, and the exorcism as a ritual. One of the purposes behind the use of religious artifacts can be understood as a distortion of how something that results familiar for those who hold dear to religious beliefs. In this movie, it's portrayed as what breaks with the supernatural, given that the only way of evicting the malevolent spiritual entity from Caroline was through the practice of an exorcism. The exorcism is used to manifest the symbol of a ritual in the film, as it can be appreciated the manifestation of the devil through the levitation and violent outbursts. The explicit appeal to psychological fear by blurring the difference between reality and fiction, as again, it plays with both the faith from the people to religious entities and how they can be presented in a context of paranormal activities. The movie questions the presence of existential and spiritual forces. When the Warren couple starts to help with the case, one of the cautions that they take is to reinforce the presence of the Holy Spirit in the house, as they start to place different elements as protective measure against the devil. This scene is a clear example of how the boundaries between the good and the evil are challenged, given that the religious measures result insufficient to evict the malevolent forces of the house. Bringing back what was mentioned before, both movies have in common the way in which they develop the psychological context. In addition to this, Suspiria also works with the idea of blurring the boundaries between fiction and reality. A key symbol developed throughout the movie is the ballet dance and the ballerina. In relation to my second cultural context, it will be narrowed into the role of women in society in 1970s. The 1970s can be defined as a decade of transition in women's roles, from the 70s onward, the demands for women's rights and the discussion of feminist idea became more widespread. Women started to be no longer caged inside the stereotypical roles imposed by society of motherhood and housewife, and step out of the darkness they lived in, into a world of decision, empowerment, and independence. Both movies break with the traditional trend line of innocent and vulnerable women, to present much more empowered and self-reliant female figures. The movie Suspiria, released in 1977, the protagonist or even antagonist roles were highly predominant by women. Along the film, we were able to appreciate how the movie's storyline storyline mirrors Susie's character development and performance throughout the movie. As it is in the case of the protagonist, Susie arrives at the school in a complete and awareness and innocent state of mind, which is completely oxymoronic to her character at the end of the movie. An example of this facet of the character of Susie can be appreciated at the beginning of the movie. Now, when it comes to the analysis of women's roles as a symbol, it can be explored through the characters of the witches and the ballerina itself. In the case of Suspiria, both the victim and the threat are characterized by female figures. Within these parameters, the film does follow the classical fairy tale of witches shown clearly in movies such as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, where the evil witch threatens the innocent little girl. The witch Elena Marcos and the headmistress are presented as flat and monstrous characters who can only do harm to fulfill themselves. The movie reinforces the stereotypical image of the witch as a malevolent and destructive woman, using the female object as a psychological horror element. The mise-en-scene in Suspiria can be highly associated with German Expressionism. The movie itself overflows the characteristics of this movement during the 1920s. Together with German horror, Italian horror emerged during the Europe's post-war era in the early 20th century. One of the concepts that comes into play is the aesthetics of horror. This term is often related to establishing a relationship between beauty and fear. The idea of beauty in a horror film can be seen as hegemonic and a harmonious environment that slowly awakens the feelings of fear and fright. In Suspiria, we get to appreciate how a setting that could be considered beautiful can still have the tendency to evoke feelings of frighting and intimidation. Instead of following the classical trend line of using a more pale or darker color palette, Argento opts for a resemblance of a horror by means of presenting the psychedelic and maximalist setting. By means of the geometrical shapes and vibrancy of the red color, the room appears to be completely full and even over-recharged, although it doesn't present any furnishing. The design of the room works to evoke the different ways in which the presence of evilness and witchcraft is always present, through the composition of symmetrical elegance achieved in geometrical patterns, in addition to the use of vivid and saturated shades of red and orange. This works given that following even the theory of colors, the red color can be easily perceived as blood, hell, and demonic. This is why the use of red color on the walls and on the entire outside of the Academy's building allegorizes how the entire Academy is possessed by the evil forces of witchcraft. The use of elevated ceilings showing how the character feels overwhelmed and shrunk in the enlarged space. When it comes to the mise-en-scene in The Conjuring, it's important to talk about it from the concept of the haunted house. This concept establishes a relationship between the narrative and the mise-en-scene. The horror in The Conjuring is depicted in a much more classical way. While Suspiria was more appealing to the psychedelic sense of the viewer, here the mise-en-scene appeals to the disgust and the fear. The mise-en-scene portrays a special anomaly waiting to be activated by an encounter with a troubled subject, in this case the new family owner of the house and the evil spirits that habitate it. An example of this is this scene, the use of the portrait as a prop, which occasionally falls down the stairs due to an evil force, depicts the relationship between the mise-en-scene and the narrative. The idea of the normal-looking suburban houses contributes to the construction of the terror as it is considered relatable for the audience. Also, the director may opt for using an old house rather than a modern house, given that it may have a historic background. In this case, the background is represented in a physical way, such as the tunnels and the hidden spaces behind the wardrobe. The use of the basement and its relevance to the story, as much as of supernatural takes places down there, emphasizes on the idea of a place resulting and inviting to the characters living inside, as it is characterized for its low lighting and storage places. It's usually full of antique furniture and props covered in spiderweb or heavy dust. Lastly, when comparing how both films represent the supernatural and the horror genre, it's important to explain it from the filmmaker's intention. In Suspiria, the use of red color can be both used as a motive in the mise-en-scene and a symbol within the cinematography and the filmmaker's intention. Although the entire film makes a use of a wide spectrum of saturated colors, it's inarguable how the red predominates in most of the scenes. We can see how in this scene, immediately after the evil force is perceived, the entire screen is tinted red. Behind the selection of color, Argento manages to make an elusive representation of the presence of malevolent forces, such as the witches, and how the depiction of a feminine storyline is tinted with blood and danger. When it comes to the filmmaker's intention in The Conjuring, as the horror is more classical than psychological, we have a frequent presence of supernatural species inside the house. The supernatural is related with ghosts, gods, spirits, paranormal curses, spells, and other supernatural phenomena. In this case, the evil doll Annabelle. The intention behind the supernatural entities is connected to the idea of how a supernatural phenomena cannot be explained by natural laws. As I previously mentioned, Argento constructs the horror genre through the psychological appeal, as it does not make a big use of spirits, corpses, or demons, and relies more on gore and disgust, as the scene of the worms. Given this, the movie focuses more on the oppression of the witches toward the main characters, the witch coven, and the psychedelic mise-en-scene. In contrast to this, James Wan constructs the horror genre in his movie by making an extensive use of supernatural objects, entities, and phenomenon, given that the movie follows a typical horror storyline, which focuses on the emotional and externalized traumas, creating a classical, chilling, haunted house atmosphere.